Are we recording? Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you ever so much for coming today, guys. I'm hoping this is going to stick to an hour long, and I will be staying afterwards if you have any questions about anything I've said. Most of this is based upon my master's research, so it's something that I actually did probably about 10 years ago. And have sort of returned to quite a lot as ever. I've cannibalized a lot of my own work. So I actually have my little thesis in front of me, and I might, on the odd occasion, read from it. You're very lucky. But let's get to that lovely first screen. So hopefully everyone can see that. So the title is It's Only Twilight if it's from the Forks region. Anything else is just sparkling vampire romance. Twilight, the Gothic novel, and the female reader. I am Dr. Kaja Franck, and you can see my Twitter handle there. You can also see my email if you desperately want to email me. And you can see the website with that I'm connected to. So my funding for my PhD came through Open Graves, Open Minds, which is dedicated to the research on the undead, but has been spreading its wings into werewolves. And if you follow us at Ogon Project online, you'll also see we're about to start doing dark fairies and fairies next year. So there will be a conference about that. And there is a CFP which will be available at that website. So that's enough of me promoting myself. I'm going to get into the lecture today. So let's talk about Twilight. And the first thing I think we need to talk about is, let me find. The first thing is the Twinaissance. I realize that is a horrible, horrible word, but I love a portmanteau and nothing can stop me from loving a portmanteau. But it's essentially the Renaissance of Twilight. I kind of became aware of it a little bit in my classroom. So I was lecturing this year, and one of the things I always do in my lectures is, regardless of the subject matter, I try and put a GIF from one of my favorite fandoms in. So when I did early American literature, it was always Supernatural GIF in there, which works so well. And then for modernism, I actually used vampire GIFs, which are a little bit more difficult to do. And I asked my students during lockdown to please find a GIF that they felt represented one of the texts that we've been studying on the Harlem Renaissance. And the first piece I got was an image of Rosalie Cullen seeking revenge on her fiance. So he and his friends essentially attacked her and left her for dead. They did attack her in a sexual way. It's a really dark bit of the novels. And she then dresses up in her wedding dress and comes back to seek revenge. And one of my students put an image up of her and said, this is really similar to the use of racial and sexual violence within Jean Toomer's work. If you don't know Jean Toomer, relatively quite a difficult, I'd say, American modernist text called Cain, and he's an African American, and I had not seen this connection. I thought, this is amazing, and I thought, oh, the Twilight generation have just grown up. And so I'm looking, because the people I'm teaching are in their early 20s, I'm looking at people who would have been, teens, tweens, reading Twilight, and they were bringing it up with a nostalgia, without a sort of hatred. And if you go online, you'll see so many memes about Twilight, and they are balanced between this excitement of how much they enjoyed it, and also a sort of sense of self-awareness. The other thing that, of course, has made this such a timely at the moment is, of course, the fact that Midnight Sun, the full text of Midnight Sun, which is the first novel from Edward Cullen's point of view, Stephanie Meyer has confirmed that it will be coming out in early August. And I wanted to compare that with the reaction of Marie Claire, because Marie Claire wrote underneath, "For the love of feminism, do not let Twilight Midnight Sun see the light of day." Now, unfortunately, Marie Claire, what you probably haven't done the research on is It's absolutely fine to let the vampires in Twilight see the light of day, because the most they're going to do is blind you with their sparkles. They're not going to burst into fire. But it kind of interested me because the reaction to the announcement of Midnight Sun was, of course, from fans, a huge amount of excitement, but immediately the detractors came back in. And I really recognize these arguments as being arguments that have been regurgitated from the arguments I was hearing 10 years ago when I was doing my master's. So what are these arguments? Well, I found a really intriguing article by Anne Gilbert called Between Twihards and Twi-Haters, talking about how vociferous the anti-Twilight crew were and how much anti-Twilight people seemed to take, they really wanted to get involved in debates. It's not simply that they said, I don't like these novels, or I don't like these texts, and I don't like these films. They wanted to step up and essentially explain why. And there's lots of reasons. So beyond artistic issues, so one of the main issues is that they're incredibly badly written, and that anyone who enjoys Twilight as literature has very, very poor taste, which I find very funny, because every time anyone says that to me, I always go, I mean, I'm a doctor in literature, so come at me, bro. Tell me about how terrible my taste in literature is. I won't lie, it generally is quite bad. I'm not a big fan of very well written stuff. So beyond artistic issues, anti-Twilighters also raise deeply grounded ideological issues that are intertwined with the aesthetic. More problematic than finding the romance between Edward and Bella poorly written is considering it dangerously abusive and anti-feminist. And we're going to return to this idea of anti-feminism in a moment. But certainly there's a real sense that in some ways these texts are bad for the reader. That those who read Twilight will end up getting into abusive relationships and will end up being unable to understand at least what a healthy relationship is. I should give a warning. There is, if you go searching for it, and a lot of this stuff has been taken down, there is a lot of homophobic attacks on Edward Cullen. So some of the language here has actually had to be changed by Facebook because it was deemed to be hate language. And we're talking, again, this is 10 years ago. So here's one of the memes that were being shared. In real life, men who sparkle are usually gay. There's a sense that somehow these weren't real vampires, which is of course an oxymoron. Vampires don't exist. And that somehow these vampires were defanged. They were too noble, too honorable, and that they were disturbing the status quo of vampiredom, if you can. So these are a number of the different Facebook sites that were coming up. Edward Cullen sucks. No, Edward Cullen, you're not a vampire, you're a fairy, literally. Twilight is a good book about vampires, lol. JK, it's about gay, sparkly fairies. I assume no one had read these texts because there are no fairies in Twilight to the best of my knowledge. But this was another issue then, that this was somehow an attack on the masculinity of vampires, which again, anyone in this room who has studied a lot about vampires would be like, they've kind of always been gay. That's just kind of the thing with vampires, guys. They've always represented queer sexuality or transgressive sexuality in some way. So weirdly, Edward Cullen is probably one of the straightest and most heteronormative vampires in the entire world. And just to let you know, that's what academics were saying. Like, they're not even transgressive. So in pop culture, they were too gay. In academic culture, they were too straight. They just couldn't win. And obviously, bisexuality was never mentioned at any point, and neither asexuality. It was just the two. The other thing that has come up is a tendency to want to decide whether Twilight was feminist, anti-feminist, or post-feminist. And I'm going to try and keep away from these arguments here, because I also think that generally this is something that we lodge at female authors and more than anyone else. So my husband's currently rewatching Mad Men, and I am hate watching it and spitting blood alongside him as he watches it. But I find that regularly shows that are aimed at men, no one would really have a discussion about whether they're feminist, anti-feminist, or post-feminist. But Stephanie Meyer, who I don't know anything about her ideology, and I'm not that interested because I tend to not go for author-centered analysis, Stephanie Meyer has been held up, and constantly people are asking about who she is, why she's writing what she is writing. I know some of you are in the reading group and might have seen Jeanette Ng's on Twitter. She did a whole thing about defining Mary Shelley by her relationship to men. And in a weird way, I think this is quite a similar idea that women, when we write, we have to write with a certain agenda and be very clear that we're telling the world this. And I'm going to again come into the idea of what duties does a female author owe their female readership. This is, however, a very good, another good text that I would recommend. So the Gothic elements of the Twilight series have invigorated an otherwise formulaic generic pattern and have demonstrated the possibilities of darkness, suffering, and passion, to quote Botting, to produce a new romantic myth. Bella's agency invites us to reconsider her position with regard to patriarchal and heterosexual norms, and to see her in a less conservative light that embraces her sexuality and remains alert to the paradoxes and possibilities of post-feminism. So this is, I mean, this is a very good article, but again, it's one that comes from the point of view is where does the text fit in regard to feminism? Whereas what really interests me is where does the text fit in regards to the Gothic? Because what always seemed to strike me is that when people read Twilight, they went, it's a vampire text. And when I read Twilight, I went, no, it's like a pretty trad, like Gothic text. It's a return to Anne Radcliffe. It's a return to these sort of texts. And in particular, not only is it a return to that, but it's also a return to the very arguments that were being had about the female reader and the female author that were being had over 200 years ago. So well, let's look at why Twilight is in many ways got a really sort of traditional Gothic or traditional female Gothic feel. So I've got all these lovely images. So first, that's an image from Munch, and that is the dead mother. Now, Bella doesn't actually have a mother who is dead, but she has an absent mother. So this sense of the moral impetus, the mother's role, is no longer there. What is interesting with Bella, though, is she actually chooses to leave her mother. So she actively chooses to put herself in the role of the Gothic heroine in many ways. The next is chastity. So that's a chastity belt from Mad Max, Fury Road, being cut off. And there is, of course, people have argued that this is abstinence porn. I like to think of it as deferred gratification. And I generally, again, I have a few issues with the tendency for people to say that this is trying to push an anti-sex message, because I think, certainly as a British reader, it was weird for me because I'm used to a sex education that, and I know it's very spotty around the country, but my sex education was certainly not abstinence-based at all. I went to a bog standard state school, and it was still a C of E school, but it was not abstinence-based. So it was quite hard for me to almost identify that, because I just wasn't aware that that was a huge thing. So when I was reading it, I was amazed by how chaste it was, but that less in a sort of a propaganda and more in it has very old-fashioned romantic quality. So there is not a huge amount of kissing, and a lot of the desire is subliminal. We also have then, of course, Edward Cullen as a bit of a hero. Now, I know Sam mentioned that they see Edward Cullen kind of like as a bit of a sort of Valancourt, and I completely agree with that. But probably slightly more proactive, because I don't think Valancourt has ever managed to prevent a car from crushing his beloved. But yeah, we have this idea that now that the girl is alone without her mother, she's going to be able to be saved by this Gothic hero, and it is the removal of the mother in some ways that allows this man to come in and essentially save her to all intents and purposes. It does promise some transgression, that's the apple. It's perhaps not as overtly transgressive, but there is still this sense that Bella wants to have sex with a monster. She wants to have sex with a vampire. And whereas traditionally that is really, really highly punished, she weirdly seems to sidestep this punishment, because although she does have the world's worst pregnancy and labor, she does somehow magically come out of it alive, even though by rights that should have killed her, and with a healthy baby. I have asked my local hospital if we have vampire venom on hand if things go wrong, and they have assured me that is not a standard thing on the NHS, which is a little disappointing. But yes, there is a sense that Bella is doing something that is slightly transgressive. We, of course, have the supernatural, represented by the supernatural. Them up in a tree is my image of the sublime. And I find this really interesting because the landscape of Forks and Washington State, it feels so incredibly like a return to the landscapes of Anne Radcliffe. And although when Bella visits the Cullens household, she's very clear to say it's not a Transylvanian castle. This is not the Munsters. They're like the inverse Munsters, if anything, because they appear clean cut, but they are actually involved in shady dealings in order to be able to get fake passports, and they are also vampires, whereas the Munsters are on the outside an insane Gothic family, but are actually really, really, really wholesome on the inside. What we are seeing is this landscape, I think, is really, really important. And they go up into the trees. The trees are a huge part, like climbing the trees are part of their love story. And indeed, the very landscape is incredibly important, because the reason why the Cullens live there is because it is so rainy and has so little sunlight, so that people won't see them sparkling. You've got women in peril, or at least you've got Bella in peril, therefore needing to be saved by Edward. And finally, you've got the dream. Now, dreams figure very significantly in the text, but in fact, the genesis of this text is meant to have been a dream. So Stephanie Meyer, and I love this because it makes a parallel with Mary Shelley, of course. Stephanie Meyer is said that she dreamt that she saw these two lovers in a meadow and they were separated, and the thing that separated them was that one was a vampire and one was a human, and they could never be together. And I think Meyer herself, she was an English literature graduate. And the text that she uses in order to cement the novel are these quite traditional female texts, especially Wuthering Heights comes up multiple times throughout the novel. So again, I think that seems to be a conscious attempt to say, this is the generic conventions I'm fitting into. And Meyer actually specifically said, I've never read vampire. Now, whether she's being disingenuous, but she said, I don't read vampire texts, I don't watch vampire films. So she herself seems to be saying, actually, I'm using the vampire, but it's completely reinvented. What I'm actually going into is this more female-centered Gothic literature. So we come to the female reader. It's assumed, and generally I would say it is not an incorrect assumption, that most of the people who were reading Twilight, certainly when it first came out, were young female readers. So that included myself. I would have been in my early 20s when I read the Twilight series. And this is where I think we start seeing this overlap between the treatment of the female reader now and the female reader in Anne Radcliffe's time in regards to the Gothic and the pernicious effects of the Gothic. And I know I'm not the first person to say this. There are many other people who've talked about how the female reader was constructed in regard to first wave female Gothic. So these are two examples. I'm so proud I got to get Urban Dictionary into my master's thesis. It amuses me a great deal. So firstly, this is an anonymous writer saying about Gothic readers, Why the representation of obscene events, which are merely the products of a disordered imagination, should not produce as bad an effect on the female mind as the relation of similar events founded on fact, we cannot conceive. So this sense that if you are reading something that is salacious or inappropriate, it is going to have an effect on you. And sort of Jane Austen plays with this idea in Northanger Abbey. Of course, what she does is far more subtle, because as she actually does say is there are real perils for women out there. And perhaps these texts that are being read are in some ways a way, of almost escaping from the real life worries. Now, if we compare this to what someone said about Twihards, so that's major Twilight fans, Twihards are stupid, obsessive people, mostly teenage girls, who are in love with fictional characters and wouldn't know a good book if it punched them in the face. Now, whilst the concerns of Twilight are not so much about its graphic violence or sexual content or its insinuation of sexual content, what we do see between both of these reviews is the idea that women are unable to distinguish between reality and fiction, and that the Gothic in particular seems to be a space that encourages women to fall into the trap, and certainly young women specifically, to fall into the trap of not being able to understand what a fantasy is. Now, I think this is particularly interesting in regards to Twilight, because Twilight is in many ways, quite obviously, it's not trying to veil this, it has a lot of romance tropes that fit into the idea of a very normative, but very widespread female fantasy about desire and love. Not all of us are going to find this is the thing that pushes our buttons, but certainly I would say that this is a text that people fell in love with, and that actually did speak to a lot of young women. But the way that these young women were then portrayed was that they were mindless. There is some very interesting, there was one particular news article that came out about a screening of Twilight that was affected by a power cut. And the young women who were there were referred to as being a sort of mindless mass, a consuming mass, as though they were zombies. And this idea as well of the female reader as a mindless consumer is particularly relevant in terms of as you start to get cheaper and cheaper productions of novels. And it's something that I think is as well is affected today by the fact that there seems to have been, and I'm going to come back to this, spawned so many copies of Twilight, but also spawned things like fan fiction. So E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey, which is of course the classic story of fan fiction gone wild, in many ways I think it disgusts people almost that came from Twilight. There is a visceral response that is yet further evidence that women weren't able to make sensible, judicious judgments about reading the text. And its popularity has been a big issue. So let's come to mothers. I know, it's everyone's favourite. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is from Psycho. And essentially it's about a very, very unhealthy mother's relationship. And the reason why I've put this up is because we always blame the mum. We always blame the mum. You find me a serial killer where they haven't blamed the mum. You always blame the mum. You blame them when they're absent and you blame them when they're there. Doesn't really matter. They're going to have done something wrong. And this idea of motherhood is then applied to the author of Gothic novels. Anne Radcliffe was referred to as the mother of a deplorable, and that her own work is spotless, in many cases a rather disreputable family. Now, this is from George Saintsbury, but there are multiple other references to Anne Radcliffe as a mother figure, or someone who makes their readers twice children, and so forth. In terms of marketing and PR, Stephanie Meyer was also encouraged to take on this role. At one point, she referred to her readers as sort of adoptive daughters. She doesn't have any female children of her own. And in this particular interview, the journalist says, Maya plops down in a chair and is immediately surrounded by girls. She pulls one onto her lap while another plays with her hair. So there's this really maternalistic performance here taking place. And the reason why I think this is so worrying is because, to come back to mothers, in the very Gothic itself, the absent mother is seen as the absent moral figure. So if you have the author as a mother figure, you are therefore applying the same moral judgment to them. They are expected to essentially be as important in the creation of their reader's moral fibre as the mother is at home. They're sort of having to take on this angel of the hearth, but through writing. And of course, the effect of that is you can then lay a lot of judgment at their door. And you also have to say that they have to take more responsibility. Here is a rather wonderful, this is from John Bennett. And he said, it is obvious to any discerning observer that female literature in this country is swelled beyond its natural dimensions. Now, the suggestion of swelled beyond its natural dimensions, I think, is a reference to pregnancy, and I think it's a reference to abnormal, unhealthy pregnancy as well. So this, to me, again, is playing back into this idea of a disgusting number of progeny, and that there is something wrong with this. So if you think about, Radcliffe being said that although her work is fine, she's somehow responsible for the people who might be copying her work. On the other side, I've got images here. So this is 20 vampire novels like Twilight to read before midnight sun hits shelves. And what's noticeable is how the advertising is. So the color tone, like the color palette that is being used, it's all to make a reference to sort of the text that is Twilight. And I think similarly, the biggest amount of hatred came to Twilight once it realized it was popular. Very early on, I read a review in the Times of Twilight, which actually said it was hypnotic prose. It was dreamy, that it spoke wonderfully to teenage alienation. Once, however, you see within 6 months to a year, the Twilight phenomenon kicking off, that is when people start getting concerned. And that is because you start seeing the power of the young female reader, particularly in terms of what they can afford and what they can buy. And this, I think, comes back in many ways as well to books and reading books and owning books. I love this particular image. So if we take Bella quite literally as beauty and Edward as the beast, then Bella herself is also buying into a consumerist fantasy. So when Bella goes to see Edward Cullen's house, she's disappointed. She's like, there's no skulls. And Edward's like, yeah, you were expecting cobwebs, weren't you? But we clean our house. And yes, she's expecting a Gothic version or an image of the Gothic that has been completely objectified and commodified and therefore can be consumed. But actually what Bella ends up getting is a rather more sanitized version. However, ultimately she becomes her own Gothic object or Gothic commodity once she is transformed into a vampire. And it is then that she starts acquiring things. She gets a fairy tale house in the woods. She gets an amazing, and I'm going to be honest with you here, I'm jealous, an amazing wardrobe. She learns how to dress herself, having been the clumsy tomboy. And I find it very interesting in these novels that we get almost no description of her. I know it's in first person, but a lot of first person text that I've read aimed at young adult audiences has the moment of looking in the mirror and going, oh, I looked at my mousy brown hair and my average skin tone and my average eye color and thought, oh, I wish I was beautiful like the blonde girls. And yet there's really none of this in the early Twilight texts. It's only when Bella becomes a vampire that she seems to understand the importance of dressing herself as an object to be consumed. So this is me quoting myself, I think what May actually does is she crystallizes anxieties about consumerism that were present in the early Gothic of the 1790s. Her work forms both a critique and reflection of commercialized society saturated with adverts and tantalizing distractions in the form of commodities. The Twilight saga represents the manner in which the cult of the commodity has not only been applied to female authors and their readership, but appropriated by Maya herself. So Maya has been PR'd, machined, they had setups, they made her into the author mother. The readership is this mindless mass that you can simply advertise whatever you want to them. But actually within the text itself, I think Maya is navigating this. And I think it is a particularly interesting aspect of the text. We can see this perhaps in the Twilight effect. So as Catherine Spooner says, the sparkly vampire is one that has been made palatable for a mass market and readily convertible into a range of consumer products, from makeup and jewelry to cars and even sex toys. They are out there. Search for them in your own time, guys. Things sparkle. But I think there's what you see, however, what's quite interesting is that although you have the amount of commodities that are associated with the novel itself, if you actually look within the novel, again, everything is reiterated to the sense of ownership. So there's so many wonderful cars. Ferraris are mentioned, for example. There's lots of sports cars. There's also Volvos. I'm not sure why there's Volvos. I think Maya thinks that Volvos are sexy European cars. This is my only theory as to why Edward Cullen drives a Volvo, which is otherwise quite a sedate and sensible car. I think it's because perhaps Maya doesn't understand necessarily what Volvos are. I'm not sure that how many Volvos are driven in the United States of America. The other thing that is put up is that the appeal of Twilight may also lie in this fantasy of overwhelming desire that is constantly delayed but may potentially find consummation. Because one of the other things that becomes really apparent is that these are hungry, hungry vampires. The level of bloodlust that you see in Twilight is in many ways far beyond anything that I've seen in any other vampire texts. You know, in terms of, Jasper, when Bella cuts herself, so Jasper is one of the Edward's adopted brothers and sisters. When Jasper cuts himself, when Bella cuts herself, Jasper, who has not got good blood control, he has tasted human blood, almost immediately seems to go for her. And I find this very interesting because the Cullens exist in a state of constant denial and self-control. Their beautiful objects that they surround themselves with actually don't ultimately fulfill them. Interestingly, however, Bella, when she turns into a vampire, has the most control of all of them. And I can't help wondering whether that's because she's a 21st century vampire. Her life has consistently been adverts, commodities, desire. And the effect of consumerist capitalist society on creating a hunger that can never fully be satisfied. So that when she becomes a vampire, not only is she find it far easier to just play the game and learn how to play along with being a vampire, but also that she finds it easier to control her desire for blood because she already lives in a society where satisfaction is being put off and deferred. Now I'm going to now compare, having talked about Gothic fiction, we did talk about The Vampire by John Polidori, and I'm going to talk a little bit here because I think actually, although Maya says that she hasn't read vampires and she hasn't, doesn't know about vampires, I think it is interesting to actually say that in no way, shape or form are the Cullens the massive deviation from the genesis of the vampire and the evolution of the vampire. Not only do we have Anne Rice's vampires becoming increasingly more, if not sparkly, their skin sheens and they become marble-like. They are also incredibly performative vampires, much like the Cullens are, although the Cullens' performance is to be normal in quite a few ways. I actually think we can see a connection about desire and about the vampiric gaze and the vampiric object and consumption, all the way back to John Polidori. So the vampire, I won't go into too much detail about it because I think quite a few of you have been to Sam's lecture where she talked about it, but it comes out in 1819, and it was originally, as the title page there shows, thought to be by Lord Byron. It's not. It's by John Polidori, his physician, and essentially it's him being very angry at Lord Byron, is the best way to put it. So I got really angry reading an article about how is Edward Cullen a Byronic hero, and I was just like, no, why would you do? And they were making links to like the vampire, and I was like, why would you do this? I'm very angry. Who was your editor? But essentially, in the vampire, you have Lord Riven. It looks like Ruthven, just to confuse you. And Lord Riven is this very evil gentleman who is the vampire, and he seduces young women, possibly young men. It's all insinuated out within the text. But what's quite interesting is, as Frayling suggests, this is the time when vampires become fashionably pallid and clean-shaven, with seductive voices and pouting lips, although I don't think they actually describe Riven's lips as pouting. I think that's a bit of Frayling getting away with himself, and they were always sexually attractive. That's quite broad strokes, but more or less, I think perhaps Frayling could be mistaking his large R romantic fiction with his small R romantic fiction. But I would certainly see the vampire as the root of this gentleman-like, the vampire's the root of the gentleman-like vampire. Conrad Quilner also says that following the period of Byron and the vampire, the bloodsucker had left the graveyard and entered the drawing room. Groomed and debonair, now he mingles within high society and is often invited into the bedroom. So that seems more like an Edward Cullen style vampire, perhaps. In terms of similarities, again, it's quite interesting. The vampire finds its genesis in the same events as Frankenstein at the Via Diodati. So much like Twilight. The vampire is a pale outsider. The fan fiction, you could argue in some ways the vampire is kind of anti-fan fiction, because it does have some similarity. It sort of lives parasitically on Lord Byron's work, and it does, although it's hating Lord Byron, it is kind of about him. And popular culture as well. So these are popular cultures. Both feature a love triangle. The main differences is, of course, the author and the audience. So the vampire probably wasn't aimed at teenage girls to such an extent, and it doesn't have a female author. The victim is particularly interesting as well, because you could argue that Bella is the victim in the Twilight series, but since she willingly wants to become a vampire, it's hard to suggest that she's a victim. In some ways, there are no real victims apart from possibly Jacob in the Twilight series. Whereas in the vampire, you have the traditional female victim. And of course, transformation. So noticeably, by the time we get to Twilight, the idea of vampires transforming their victims into themselves is something that is part of how we understand vampires. Whereas within the vampire, very confusing because vampires everywhere, within the vampire, there's no sense that any of Lord Riven's victims are going to be transformed. Partly perhaps because they are young women and Lord Riven sees them as disposable. Why would he want to make them like him? There'd be no point in having a young woman around. So what I find interesting is that there is a love triangle in the vampire. And it's a queer love triangle. Because again, guys, everyone who thinks Edward Cullen is gay, he's really not, but vampires kind of always have been. So you've got Riven, Aubrey and Ianthe. So Aubrey is the human protagonist who makes friends with Riven, and Aubrey falls in love with Ianthe, and Riven kills Ianthe. Now, you have to look into the text to see how obsessed Aubrey is with with Riven, but it is certainly there. So it's described that the deadly hue of his, so that's Riven's face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion, though its form and outline were beautiful. So we've got a beautiful vampire. At this point, Aubrey's just following him about, looking at him, being like, wow, this guy's really cool. I want him to be my friend. He soon formed this object into the hero of a romance. Again, this is Aubrey looking at Riven and going, he's a hero of romance. And again, it's so interesting. He's using the term object. So although Riven seems to be the scary creature of the night that's going to attack and kill people, under Aubrey's gaze, he's just an object to be looked at and consumed. So we might think Riven is the consummate consumer here, but in some ways, so is Aubrey. And though Aubrey was near, again, the object of his curiosity, so a pacifying of Riven, this beautiful vampiric object, he obtained no greater gratification from it than the constant excitement of vainly wishing to break the mystery. So he's never going to be satisfied. Now, you could argue that this lack of satisfaction is because it is queer desire, so it can't necessarily be satisfied upon the page within the early 1800s. But it does again seem to hint back to that earlier quotation about vampires being associated with delayed gratification. And I think this is basically this scene, essentially. When we first see the Cullens, and they are in a cafeteria, and they are basically the cool kids who we will never be like. We can aspire to be like. They have beautiful clothing that we're not going to be able to afford. Mayer writes they wear designer clothing, but it's subtle enough that you know it's expensive, but it's not flashy. And they sit together. And they sit together and don't eat. They sit in front of an unopened can of soda and an unbitten apple. And there we have Rosalie, the blonde female vampire, holding an unbitten apple. And this reminds me a lot of like Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn. And he talks there about the lover reaching out to another, and they never, you're never going to capture that person. So you have this unopened, this unbitten. It's the moment before the pleasure. And much like Aubrey looks at Riven as a vampiric object, it's like, I'm never going to get replete from this. And again, any sort of sexual consummation is deferred through the death of Ianthe, the young female character. I think we get this sense here. But again, this is where Bella comes in and re-navigates this. As a consummate consumer, she gets to consume Edward, and we get to consume Edward alongside her. She has a devouring gaze. In this description of Edward, it's essentially a blazon. So blazons are much beloved of sort of the love sonnets and Renaissance courtly love. And as some people have argued, blazons in which you describe every particular feature of someone, and typically it's a man describing a woman, it's literary violence in that it is cutting down someone to their constituent parts rather than seeing themselves as their own whole subject. And here we see Bella doing the same thing. My eyes traced over his pale white features, the hard square of his jaw, the softer curve of his full lips, twisted up into a smile now, the smooth marble span of his forehead, partially obscured by a tangle of rain-darkened bronze hair. She goes on to say that he's got a face that a male model would sell their soul for. She regularly mixes high and low culture, talking about him as having the face that a Renaissance artist would paint, or looking like a marble statue, but then also looking like a male model. In both cases, these are about pacified forms of male beauty. And this is about the female gaze looking at the man. And in some ways, I've always sort of wondered, the main thing that I think that I found really telling for why there is such a pleasure in this text is it allows a female reader, and certainly a young female reader, to stare at an object of desire without getting caught. What's perhaps quite interesting is not only are you not getting caught, but there's a real sense that Edward enjoys it. For those of you who have not read any Midnight Sun, and there was an extract put on Maya's website ages ago, but then taken down, but I'd read it by then, Edward talks about the pleasure of Bella's gaze on himself. And because of his mind-reading skills, he's also constantly looking at himself as an object. He hears what other people are saying about him and how they're framing him. So Edward has internalized, in many ways, the female gaze. I don't know how many of the male students at Fawkes High School are also looking at Edward with desire. That's not made explicit in the text, unfortunately, but please do feel free to write fan fiction about it. But he essentially learns how to objectify himself and to take some pleasure from that. We see, therefore, that actually, if we're then looking at victims in terms of returning to Polidori's vampire, Edward Cullen becomes, in some ways, more like Ianthe, the creature that is eaten. So Cullen is essentially between the vampire, Riven, and Ianthe, the female victim. When Aubrey describes Ianthe, he says, as she danced upon the plain or tripped along the mountainside, one would have thought the gazelle a poor type of her beauties. And Edward Cullen is described by Bella as, finally I spotted him, still under the dense shade of the canopy at the edge of the hollow, watching me with cautious eyes. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with where this comes from what I like to think of as the sexy striptease scene. This is the scene where Edward shows Bella the fact that he sparkles. Now, when he shows her this, he takes her to a beautiful meadow. He sets up the entire structure of it. He then slowly undoes his buttons on his shirt, shows off that he sparkles, and when Bella reaches out to touch him, he runs off to the side, because as anyone who may have gone to a strip club knows, you can look, you just can't touch. That is not what you're meant to do. And Bella talks about the fact that this shocking diamond-like sheen on him, he literally looks like a girl's best friend. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. And as well as this, then Bella then talks about how he's the one who's cautious. He's like a little deer looking out at her going, oh no, are you going to touch me again? I'm scared. And I think that's, again, quite an interesting thing, because the main source, the main person who expresses desire within the text is, in fact, Bella. And Bella is constantly the one who wants to have sex with Edward. And Bella is the one who looks at him, who describes him. The whole text, apart from a few sections in the final novel, are written from her point of view. The I, she is the subject, and Edward becomes the object. Now, I tend to connect this back to Laura Mulvey, who I'm sure we're relatively familiar with, but for those who might not be, basically Laura Mulvey says, and this is so broad strokes, but essentially she says, when you go to the cinema and you watch a film in which there's a sexy lady and basic James Bond, let's talk James Bond. If you go to the film and you watch James Bond, there's a sexy lady, okay, and then there's James Bond. And when we're watching it, if you're a man, and this is a very heteronormative setup, if you're a man, you're meant to be looking at the sexy lady going, I want to be James Bond looking at the sexy lady. I'm just going to look at women. It encourages the idea that there's the active male gaze and the passive female performance. And then if you're watching it as a straight woman, you internalize the pleasure you get about being an object and being sexualized by the male gaze, and that's where you get your pleasure from. So that's how the pleasure works. I will bring this up to just say, James Bond, I want to know what sexually transmitted disease he has, because so many of the women he sleeps with die within 48 hours of sleeping with him. It must be the deadliest of all of that. But essentially that's what Laura Mulvey sets up. Now, as I mentioned, this is, of course, a very heteronormative setup, but it's also one that disavows in any way the idea that the male could be the object of the gaze. And one of the big things that kept coming up as we were reading, or as I was reading reviews of Twilight, is how much hatred was coming from male reviewers, with the exception of Mark Commode, who just went, yeah, the movie's fine, but it's probably not for you, so just don't watch it if you don't want to. And I really like Mark Commode for that. But one of the things that I think comes up is, I think there is almost a fear coming through from some of these male reviewers at the idea that they may be the object, and the idea that they might be the one that is being objectified. Whereas, what was also becoming clear, there's a very good review in The Guardian that's pointed out that in the first novel, in many ways, Edward Cullen is very feminized. Now, I found this an interesting, if problematic, statement, because the suggestion is that men can only be objectified if they're also feminized. And I think that links back probably to why, all the way right at the beginning, we were seeing so many people referring to Edward Cullen as gay, because this is to do with the female gaze, and it's somehow feminizing the male if you are the object of sexual desire. I think that's incredibly problematic. But certainly, this does seem to be a lot of the hatred and fear around Edward, that somehow he's pacified simply because he lets himself be an object, and he doesn't use his physical strength or violence. I'm going to, these are again some more images of him sparkling, but I think what it shows is, in this particular scene, now this is translated from the book to the film, when he first shows that he's sparkling, you can see by the close-up at the bottom, the camera pans all the way down him. And we are encouraged to be alongside Bella consuming the vampire. So the consumer readers that had started, these mindless twihards who just want everything that is about Twilight, one of the reasons why I also think there's an attack on them is because this makes them therefore less of a threat. If we actually acknowledge that through their gaze, much like Bella's gaze, there is desire, there is an exploration of female desire, again, heterosexual female desire, or bisexual female desire, then that needs to be controlled. So when these issues of taste come up, I wonder how much they're to do with issues of where we expect women's sexuality to be, as much as where we expect women sort of like power to be for financial acquisition and commodification. So ultimately, I think Twilight continues to be a rich and difficult text to analyze. I have no simple answers. I can never come down on one side of Twilight or the other. But there are a few things that do come up. So if you will allow me, I'm just going to read a little bit from my conclusion, which was essentially me also going, I don't really have a conclusion, but Catherine Spooner argues that there is a patchwork aspect to Gothic, whereby pieces of distinctly different fabrics nevertheless linked through patterning and repetition, meeting through the juxtaposition of edges. While Fred Botting uses a similar image when describing capitalism, suggesting that the exercise in evacuating and then reconstructing the meaning of objects and signs lies at the heart of consumer society, with advertising, marketing, and branding repeatedly capitalizing on the power of simulation to sell goods and stimulate desires. Their language of reconstruction and renewal surrounding the Gothic and commercial creates an ever-changing entity, fluid, evolving to catch up with the desires of a society, acknowledged or not. As we've seen, the Gothic and consumerism have forever been linked. Indeed, perhaps the source of the Gothic was the sudden influx in the commodities designed to distract and tantalize. The threat of early Gothic and its relationship to women was the fear of degradation into a society where the original no longer had meaning. Mayer's texts have simply returned to this source. Her vampires are a patchwork of Gothic tropes and commercialized images designed to simulate desire, and the responses to her work have echoed the ones aimed at early Gothic. This sudden move in Mayer's fairy tale Gothic away from excessive expressions of violence and sexuality to a restrained morality where the only disproportionate sensuous language relates to the aesthetic, the fetishized dead object that is the vampire, causes a strange apprehension and delight. A reaction that Bella recognizes, that first uncomfortable immersion in fantasy, a quotation taken from Breaking Dawn. Perhaps the uncomfortable sensation of reading Twilight is the uncanny realization that contemporary Gothic has unconsciously returned, a true revenant, to its site of origin. It would seem appropriate that at the beginning of a new millennium, defined equally by promise as by fear, the Gothic has emerged once again, incorporating our fears about a commercialized society by using the weapons of aesthetic commodification in order to stake a central position in our world. Now, Nina Auerbach argued that at the end of the 20th century, vampires needed a long sleep. And yet the vampire has awoken again, refreshed and beautiful, advancing straight from the pages of the novel into our imagination, and primarily sparkling into the sunshine. I'll leave it there. I think I basically more or less got that bang on an hour. So what I will do is stop sharing. I know I've lost my mouse. So when I find my mouse again, I think it's turned off. I will stop sharing, and then if anyone wants to send me any questions. Oh, the 66 comments. Rami Malek was in the film. There you are. First important question dealt with. Yes, he was.
It's not mostly questions, it's mostly just
yeah.
Twilight chats.
Michael Sheen was also there. Does anyone have any questions for me?
I do.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile? Like, I enjoyed Twilight when it came out, don't get me wrong. I read it like a maniac. And then I started reading criticism, and a lot of it is exactly what you said, but then a lot of it is Jacob falling in love with a baby and her racism when it came to the real Quileute tribe. So it's I think a complicated issue to kind of meld these two together.
Yeah, certainly I didn't talk a lot about Jacob, because if you look at that side of things, that is where it becomes particularly upsetting. I will say, all credit to the Quileute tribe, they have, as far as I can see, really used Gothic tourism to essentially tell the stories of their own tribe. Because for anyone who doesn't know, everything that Jacob says about being a shapeshifter and turning into a wolf is absolute nonsense and has no basis within that particular tribal belief system at all. But you can now go to Forks, and you can go to La Push, and you can go to that area, and you can have tours, and members of the Quileute tribe will tell you actual stories from their culture. I would say, how do you bring those together? You can't. I think this is the other thing that's particularly, that for me is why I think Twilight is worth studying, because there is criticism and also celebration in multiple different aspects of it. And I don't think you can ever essentially coalesce these and come down with a final conclusion of, yes, Twilight's good or Twilight's bad. I think it has very problematic elements to it, and I don't want to diminish that. But in some ways, that's what makes it the text that it is. That it is so unsettling because of the fact that there are so many difficulties when you're getting your head around it. And the Jacob imprinting on Renesmee is, for those of you who aren't aware, spoilers, Jacob is a shapeshifter, referred to as a werewolf throughout the text, but in the final book you find out that he's actually a shapeshifter, and he is a Native American, and he's been in love with Bella, and then when Bella and Edward have a child called Renesmee, terrible name, Jacob essentially what is called imprints on Renesmee, meaning that she is going to be his partner in the future. So he does not, and it's very explicit, have any sexual or romantic feelings for this child at this point, or baby, but in the future, whether this child likes it or not, they are going to marry Jacob. And they have no choice in that.
I believe there's also, when he's giving the backstory for imprinting, he talks about a similar situation having happened, where someone imprinted on a 2-year-old child, and he's now this girl's best friend, and like will be whatever she needs as she grows up, with every implication that they will become a couple when they grow up.
Yeah, there is, because that's the other defense that they put in there. It's very weird. It's very uncomfortable. It's very why Mayer should have had a better editorial team towards the end of writing those novels. But like I said, I find that uncomfortable. I find that problematic, and I find it really, really, really bloody weird. And I can't find an excuse or explanation for that. It just exists within the novel as this very, very strange thing. And like you pointed out, there are huge numbers of issues around racism and around the representation of Native Americans as well. And I hold my hands up and I say, it's the most difficult, for me, it's one of the most difficult parts of Twilight. And I can't offer any answers. Well, other than systematic, obviously, destruction of the Native American peoples over hundreds of years, and complete lack of recognition or representation for hundreds of years that have led Mayer to think that she could simply appropriate whatever culture she wanted and come up with a like crazy system of folklore for them. That's about it.
There's a question in the chat for you from Caro. I don't know if you can see it.
Life and death. I agree with you. I read it and I thought, how interesting, but I don't think it does prove that gender doesn't matter at all, because ultimately Twilight is it's a conservative romance. It's a conservative love story. It's I think essentially it Twilight fits within so many genres. There's one interesting, I don't know if anyone's read Twilight of the Gothic by Joseph Crawford.
Very good.
He makes a really interesting point about this, though. And again, I find this is interesting in terms of what we're talking about. He was inspired to write this entire novel, Twilight of the Gothic, where essentially he also found that his students were Twilight generation. They were growing up. And he was like, these were young women who were able to have very constructive discussions about Twilight's problems and its benefits, why they liked it, why they didn't like it. But in particular, he joined a reading group, and they were all reading different texts, and they were meant to be schlocky texts. So you could choose a text, and it was meant to be a bad text, so like a spaghetti western or something like that. And someone chose Twilight, and he said, of all the texts that we read, and you could argue that they were all equally risible and on the same level of bad literature, that was the one that had the most vehement hatred. And that made him realize that as a genre, romance is one of the least analysed and least understood and most dismissed. So I think, it's a genre and it's got that formulaic pattern, and there's a comfort in it. I remember my mum bringing me home Mills and Boons, and sometimes Mills and Boons Temptation when I was a little bit older. She didn't know what was in it. She was so naive. She brought me the Anne Rice erotica novels. I had no idea what was in it. I was just reading like the Sleeping Beauty one, like, I'm 16. This is going to affect me. I'm just going to put that out there, Mum. Bless her. Someone had said, oh, it's Anne Rice. Your daughter likes Anne Rice. So yeah, I don't think it's as effective as she thinks it is. And yeah, I think you can see the manipulation she has to do with the text. Someone's mentioned Rosalie, in order to make it work. And that manipulation sort of goes, well, then it's not as simple that you can just swap the genders in that case. Any other questions?
Did you have one, Mason? I think I saw your hand earlier, and maybe Glenn.
Yeah, so I was just going to go back to the note about the weird thing with Jacob and Renesmee and where that all came from. I read an article that was saying, and I know you said you don't really look into Maya's background, but I read an article that linked the whole Jacob Renesmee plotline to her Mormonism, because it was sort of the name Renesmee. There's kind of a Mormon cultural thing of really prizing unique names for infants, and also like using, because it's like a portmanteau name of the grandparents, and that's apparently a common cultural thing for Mormons. And the other thing was an idea of like a predestination, which is sort of idealized. You've got your perfect mate out there, and that's sort of like, that's come through in the text in this really sort of weird way, because it's kind of like she's written a non-religious, like, or a text that doesn't overtly reference her religious beliefs, but has these hints of a culture which is not entirely mainstream. And when it comes through, when those things come through unnoticed, they're really weird because they're so different to what you might be expecting in sort of a mainstream cultural reading.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I would definitely say, I wonder to what extent is she even aware that that's what she's bringing in? Because it is, I mean, it is the case that if you have, if you've grown up with a cultural belief, then it is going to affect how you see things. I'm sure there are lots of things that if I wrote about things that I accept as given, people are like, that's really weird. And you'd have to understand where I came from, what my background was. I do think as well, though, it's quite interesting that you said about that sense that there's predestination. So most of my sister was very good friends with a Mormon girl when I was younger, so I've learned a bit through that, and then I listened to the last podcast on the left's deep dive into Mormonism. But I am interested in that idea of predestination, because you see, again, within romantic fiction and within our culture more widely, soulmates, the idea of soulmates, are quite an accepted idea. People regularly refer to themselves, this is my soulmate, the person I married was my soulmate. So although it's a strange expression of that, you could see it as being tied in to that. The other thing I think is interesting is that idea of predestination of an older man with a younger person. It's very Jane Austen. Mm. If you think about things like Mr. Knightley as well, and Emma, he's a lot older, but he's basically like, I've seen you since you were a child. And there is that sort of like, and I'm going to end up with you. So although it seems really peculiar to us, and our first reaction is always revulsion. And I should say, interestingly enough, thanks to the supernatural, the young female is not going to end up with an older male, because Jacob just won't age. So Renesmee will get to an age, and when they're the same age, that's when they can be together. But I think it's weird, and it may well have an influence on sort of the idea of Mormon predestination. But I also think it's an expression of some weird ideas that we totally accept within our society, like a soulmate. Because if you can accept a soulmate, the idea is that that's also predestined, that there's just one person out there. And again, and for us, we find that a romantic idea. Or I'm sure a lot of people here may well be very critical of that, as I am. It's not a term I use about my partner. But it is certainly something I think that is a backbone, where if we really analyse it, just because we've sat and been comfortable with it, we'd also find it uncomfortable. Did you say, oh, yes, go for it.
So the other thing I wanted to ask, going back to Mayo's attempt at saying that gender doesn't matter, one thing that really interested me was, especially towards the later books, Breaking Dawn and forward, how she deals with pregnancy and childbirth, not only with vampires where the women can never give birth, and how strongly Rosalie comes out against Edward suggesting abortion. And it's also there in Leah and the Werewolves, where a lot of Leah's bitterness is attributed to the fact that she's lost the person she thought she was in love with and will never be able to have children. I believe there was a direct correlation to the fact that, you know, she thought she was in love with this guy. He goes off and imprints on someone else. Her cousin, who she's really close with, dumps her, and now she can't have children.
Yeah, there's a lot of really uncomfortable stuff around monstrous childbirth, but also particularly female fertility. And that idea that male vampires are still fertile, but female vampires have to give it up. And Rosalie is, in some ways, that's her biggest loss. So Bella says to Rosalie, but you've got your happy ending. You've got Emmett, you've got this wonderful life, you're a vampire, that's all I want to be. And Rosalie's like, I'd give it all up to be human in order to be able to have a child. And there is that real, again, that sense that the women are defined by childbirth and that they will never be satisfied unless they can have a child. Now, as this is always something that I come back to what extent is Twilight informing that, or is Twilight simply essentially a reflection of what we already have within our society? And I speak at the moment with maybe a little bit more insight, but the absolute pressure around childbirth and around pregnancy, and about how you should be feeling, and about the fact that you should be feeling fully satisfied and what have you. I do wonder to what extent, again, I try not to say Twilight was the cause of it. I try to say it's a reflection of this. Because what's quite interesting is Bella is completely willing to give up her ability to have children. She literally does not see it as a loss. It's only when she has an accidental pregnancy that she actually starts thinking of it as something that she might want, because it's just not been in her brain. Around the abortion issue, and again, apologies guys if this gets sensitive, but again, in my experience, abortion is a thing that I find that everyone around me is totally okay with and pro-choice, until it comes to someone needing an abortion. And then they don't want to talk about it. And then they don't want to admit that it's an option. And so again, I think that itself is, firstly, I suspect Maya is canny enough to be able to work out that you're probably not going to be able to sell a book that has an abortion in. I think it's still in young adult literature a really hot topic if you put abortion in. Yes, that's a big issue book, and it might not sell places, and it might have to be banned, and it might be terrible. But yeah, I mean, I agree. But the flip side of seeing that is that the only people who think that Bella should have an abortion are the men. And the women don't. And both Sam, who is the leader of the shapeshifter pack, and Arrow, who is sort of the vampire leader, see Bella's pregnancy as an abomination, and that it is abnormal or strange or transgressive fertility. And I found it interesting that the way that Renesmee and the birth of Renesmee is treated much like a monstrous birth that you might see in the same critiques of female authorship. So just like Anne Radcliffe has given birth to this obscene progeny of literature, and it must be stopped, and at that point it's male critics saying it must be stopped. I think there is a parallel way of thinking that Bella is being told by men, this must be stopped. You don't know what your body has produced. Your desire, your abnormal desire for a vampire has created an abomination. And this must, we're going to step in. We're going to give you an abortion. So because of the way it's set up, it's not, I think, as simple as this is an anti-choice text. I think there's two ways of framing it. And again, this is the difficulty of reading Twilight. There's always two ways of framing it in many of the cases. So even that, I think, is a more complicated way. I think it's more complicated in how it's set up than as simple as, it's a pro-life argument.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to sort of bring us to a bit of a close because we're up to the end of the time that I've booked, so I don't know how long it's going to last. I think they give you an extra 15 minutes, but I'm not sure. I should just stop booking a time. Do you know what I mean? Just leave it forever. They all think for the comment.
I'll be on Twitter, so if anyone wants to just send me messages on Twitter, that's absolutely fine. Yes. I don't think I'll be doing much today.
And there's obviously another talk at 6 p.m. So if anybody wants to come twice, you're always very welcome, as usual. But thank you so much to Kaja for coming. Thank you for the talk. It was amazing. And I look forward to hearing it again later. And yes, thank you so much. If anyone has anything they want to say before leaving, then feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to bring the meeting to a close, I guess. And Kaja, if you want to say goodbye or anything.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. It was lovely to do this. Thank you so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you found it interesting. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.